Justin, thanks for coming on again. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. I'm an academic. I run a channel called Esoterica, which studies esotericism. That would be the study of things like the occult or alchemy, or Kabbalah, magic, but studies it from a secular academic angle. So I get to study all the weird stuff, but I don't have to be compelled to believe in any of it, which is quite nice. So academic, I study that stuff professionally, and I'm a host of the channel Esoterica.
Nice. So the topic today was Solomonic magic. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so there's several different distinct magical traditions that exist in the Western world. One large of those traditions is a tradition called ceremonial magic, of which Solomonic magic is a species of that ceremonial magic. And basically, it's all the magical traditions associated with Solomon. This is a pretty huge bunch of texts and traditions. But in general, Solomonic magic is the use of various kinds of names of God, ritual apparel, ritual furniture. I'm sure you folks have seen things like magic's circles, using the name of God to bind and control demons to get them to do what you want. So, demons are out there in the world according to this tradition, and you can use various kinds of techniques basically to bind and control them.
And when was the origin? What was the origin of Solomonic magic? And have you tried any? Does it work?
No, I've not tried any. Yeah, I think that I just get things done the old-fashioned way. Well, I guess the old-fashioned way might be getting them done with demons. I don't know. But at any rate, so there are traditions that go way, way back, at least a couple of millennia. So as far back as the Roman Jewish historian Josephus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, we both see the ability of certain people to use techniques like magic rings, for instance, to manipulate demons. So the tradition goes back at least a couple of thousand years. And what we see, and we could get into this if we want, a kind of slow development from a period of time where there are legends about Solomon's controlling demons to actually practical guides to control them the way that Solomon did. So there's a long evolution stretching back a couple thousand years, really a little more than a couple thousand years, in which this tradition developed and emerged. So it's quite ancient, predates Christianity probably. So it's in many ways a very veritable ancient tradition.
And what are the typical things they can use demons to do or attempt to do?
A wide range of things. You can get people to fall in love with you, or not really fall. They just have sex with you. So it's basically just magical roofies, horrible. So you can get demons to find treasure for you, which are my favorite spells. So you get them to find treasure for you. You can get them to build things for you. Solomon allegedly used demons to build the temple in Jerusalem. You can get them to turn you invisible. You can get them to transport you very quickly long distances. You can get them to tell you the future. Demons, because they live high up in the atmosphere, they live just below the moon, according to this belief. This is another idea that's very strange to people. We often think of demons now as living in hell, like underneath the earth, and they come out and do bad stuff, I suppose. But ancient peoples primarily imagined demons living between the earth and the moon. So they lived up in the sky as opposed to in the ground, which is a very different conception of them. But because they lived so far up in the sky, they could tell the future. And so you could use them to learn about what's going to happen. You could use them to manipulate the weather, wide range of things. And typically this was all parceled out in terms of tasks. So certain demons are really good at, I don't know, teaching you certain kinds of things, and certain demons are good at this, certain demons are good at that. So if you were going to summon them, you had to kind of know both how to summon them, but you also had to know what their specialty was. Because if you summon the love demon and you when you get the treasure demon, you're not going to get what you want.
What do these rituals look like?
They range a bit, but typically they're going to involve some degree of ritual apparel. So you're gonna have to dress in some specific kind of way. Some of these apparel is quite fabulous, like lion pelts and things like that. So you get dressed up in these apparels. Typically, they involve some kind of ritual purification. And what basically happens is you use divine names of God. These demons can be controlled and manipulated through the use of various divine names, typically in Hebrew, although over time the Hebrew gets completely garbled. And by the time you get to the Middle Ages, it's just like squiggly lines and nonsense. Um, and so what you would do is you would use these magical words, these divine names. You would force the demons into a kind of a holding pen. Typically, it's a triangle in shape. And then in order to protect yourself, you would surround yourself with various divine names inside of a magical circle. So the idea basically is that you're using divine power to force these demons into a basically a pen, and then once they're inside that pen, you can effectively torture them to get them to do what you want. So I don't know about the ethics of torturing demons, but um, that is a thing that people did. People also, did cruel things to animals back in the day too. But also is a thing that people don't realize is that at this time, people often thought of demons as something that wild animals that could be, manipulated if you wanted to. In the same way you could get a donkey to carry something, you could get a demon to carry you long distances very quickly. So that's the general gist of it. But every magical text, and there are hundreds of these, every one of these is slightly different. So there's a wide range of techniques, which are probably various traditions being knit together, but also just corruptions of traditions that occur over time.
And how common were these traditions? How many people actually practiced these kinds of magics? How big were the communities of people who did this kind of thing?
I suspect there's probably not large communities of people, but I would say that one always has the survival bias is always a problem with texts. The texts that survive don't tell us about the communities, and the communities that survive don't tell us about texts. There's not an inherent logical relationship between those two things, although sometimes we treat them that way. Um, of the Solomonic magical tradition, the main text that survived is a tradition called the Key of Solomon literature, the Clavicula Solomonis literature. Of that text, about 150 manuscripts survive. So when you're talking about 150 manuscripts of texts that would have been persecuted, you're not supposed to have books like this in the Middle Ages. The Christians really did not like you having books like that. So if you're talking about 150 texts surviving from the Middle Ages, that's a substantial chunk of manuscript tradition, and they survive all through Europe, and they survive in various conditions, and they survive in various levels of quality production. So the general consensus among scholars at this point is that there must have existed through the Middle Ages, at least, what is referred to as a clerical necromantic underground. And that clerical necromantic underground probably was priests, probably low-level priests, um, probably only able to do exorcisms. You could, if you became a priest, there were different ranks that you could get. So, for instance, you could do exorcisms before you could administer the mass. That's still true, actually. And so, these exorcist priests, which are relatively low down on the pole, they were probably engaging in this stuff and would probably sell their services to people. And they were the kind of people that were able to do the kinds of rituals that would be involved in all this. So, how many people? We don't know. But ubiquitous enough that hundreds of manuscripts survive all through Europe uh, and are distributed pretty evenly through Europe. So there was some network of these people, and they were actively engaged in attempting to summon demons, I suppose.
And who wrote these manuscripts?
We don't know. Obviously, it's not the kind of thing you publish and put your name on because that's a target on your back. These are the days of the Inquisition and the witch hunts, so you're not gonna publish it under your name on Amazon.com in the Middle Ages. So we don't know. The earliest manuscripts that we have, if we do the math, you think about what kind of people are literate, what kind of people understand ritual practice, what kind of people have the access to the kind of lore that would be required to do this kind of stuff. The only answer that jumps out are priests. That's the only group of people that could have produced this kind of literature in any substantial numbers. So the general consensus is that probably low-ranking orders in the Catholic priesthood are at least copying this literature, probably also adding to it and editing it as they go. Um, some of them are interesting. They have marginal notes where they'll say, "I tried this and it didn't work, but I tweaked this and then it worked." So you get this sort of the Latin word for a magical spell in Latin is experimenta. And so there's a sense that it's a thing to be tinkered with. And we actually do have evidence of the marginalia of them tinkering with this. Now, how far back this literature goes and who was producing it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have no idea. What did an exorcist look like in the first century of the Common Era? Probably someone like Jesus. But in general, we're talking about a situation where they don't leave a lot of evidence for us to sort out who wrote this kind of stuff. And it's not like in the early 20th century where you'd be like a Victorian edgelord like Aleister Crowley trying to show off how edgy and cool you were by summoning demons, because there were no real consequences in 1930 to doing this. But in 1330, you could get killed. And so they didn't leave a lot of traces of who they were.
So what was it that inspired them to try to pursue this kind of activity?
I imagine what inspires people to do anything. Power, the ability to manipulate people. I mean, who likes to clean their house? You get a demon to do it for you. Who likes to be poor? You get a demon to find you buried treasure. Who wants to be alone forever? You get a demon to get you a girlfriend. I don't know. So I imagine it's the same kinds of things that motivate people at all times. Basically, people are lazy and they don't want to actually work for anything. And so they're more than happy to have a demon do it for them and shortcut the hard work of, learning Latin or going out and getting a job. So I suspect it's the human desire to not work and get stuff for free.
But you'd expect that the fact that, as an atheist who doesn't believe in magic, I wouldn't expect any of it to work, yet it seems to have been a very consistent tradition for thousands of years. So why would people continue to pursue it if it didn't potentially work as we would expect it not to?
Yeah, I mean, people also pray, right? And so and they do that, regardless of the efficacy. People pray to all kinds of contradictory beings. So I suspect that in the same way that people still pray for things, and if there's no God answering those prayers, which I don't think that there is, I can imagine that in the same way that let's say you go to the official Catholic channels or Jewish channels or Hindu channels to get what you want. So you pray to God to get, I don't know, rich, and God isn't really delivering. Well, you might go next door to the necromancer guy, and the necromancer guy might tell you, look, you contact this demon and get rich another way. So I suspect that part of how it functioned is that there was obviously the mainstream of religion, and that promised you whatever it promised you. And then when that failed you, which every religion will fail because there are no gods giving people things, you would go to the next best thing. And the next best thing was, if I can't get God to give it to me, I'll get a demon to give it to me. So I suspect it functioned because religion functioned. And when it failed, I suspect that you got the same exact answers why religion fails. Well, the Lord works in mysterious ways, or you didn't pray correctly, or you didn't pray to the right God, or you didn't do the spell exactly right. You got the name wrong, or whatever. So I imagine that the fact that the tradition became so corrupt was just as much of a bug as it was a feature. So when you didn't get a magic girlfriend with your magic spell, you went to your magic spell guy, and he's like, "Yeah, you didn't say the thing right." So I suspect that it came out very similar in the wash. So why do people do superstitious things? Well, there's a huge gamut running from, praying to get stuff all the way to tinkering around with talismans and things like that. And I imagine it's all part of one long spectrum as opposed to a disjunctive kind of either or option. I imagine it was always both and.
And you mentioned it got corrupted. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you by corrupted, I don't mean that there was a pure version that worked and then it got mucked up later. I suppose that's possible, but what we're talking about is a situation where we're relying on manuscripts. And if you've ever, I always tell people, if you want to you learn about how the Bible got transmitted, just go copy 50 lines of something and see how many mistakes you make. Well, let's compound that, right? If we compound that with there's a whole bunch of text, and then there's a bunch of Hebrew that Latin Christians didn't understand, they would just copy it out best they could. And as you could imagine, again, I don't know if you know Hebrew or Sanskrit, but if I handed you a text of the Rig Veda in Sanskrit and asked you to copy it out, well, imagine by the time that you copied it and I copied it and 16 other people copied it, who none of us knew Sanskrit, we'd just get squiggly lines by the end. And so what we mean by corrupt is that a lot of the imagery that we see the magic circles and the Hebrew and the magical words, because they're at some level, the exact mechanism by which they're supposed to work isn't understood. Well, if you don't understand it, you may not copy it correctly. And so if you don't really understand what's happening, then you're not going to be able to copy it correctly because you have no way of knowing what's supposed to be there. This is what separates, for instance, I don't know, if you're copying out a chemical reaction from a chemistry textbook, if you understand the chemical reaction, you're not going to copy it incorrectly, typically, because you actually understand what's happening. If you have a magical circle with all kinds of weird diagrams and they're all bizarre, the odds of you making a mistake copying it are very high because none of it makes any sense. You're just copying kind of vaguely what you see. And of course, you can imagine with things like Hebrew and things like that, it gets very badly corrupt. I mean, as a reader of Hebrew, I can look at some of these medieval magical texts and they're just like squiggly lines. And you can kind of tell what the Hebrew was originally, but often by the time it gets down 3 or 4 centuries, it's just gibberish. But it is interesting in this regard, though, that it does sometimes tell you the antiquity of it, because you'll be looking at what is gibberish in the medieval Latin period, but clearly some of it's Aramaic. I'm sure folks have heard of abracadabra. Abracadabra is kind of quasi-corrupt Aramaic, which no kid saying abracadabra that they learned from, I don't know, Harry Potter or whatever, they have no idea they're speaking Aramaic. But this shows you just how ancient these ideas are, that they were part of a much older tradition that's being imported in, but the corruption does sink in eventually.
So if they didn't know what the Hebrew meant, how did they know it was related to Solomonic magic or what it was expecting them to do from the text?
Well, the instructions would be in Latin, and the words of power would be in Hebrew. And this is just an old idea that if you've read the book of Genesis, folks will know that the way that the Israelite mythology works is that the Israelite God spoke the world into being. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Yehi or, and then there was or, there was light. Well, because God spoke creation into being, and allegedly did that with the Hebrew language, whatever that means, the Hebrew language retains some kind of link between its linguistic reality, but also its metaphysical power. And therefore, if you want to manipulate reality, the best way to manipulate reality is by using the exact same language that God allegedly did. So if God can speak light into being using the Hebrew language, well, then you could do that as well. It's a very ancient idea going back to the to the turn of the Common Era, at least, probably before that. And so the idea was you maintain the words of power, typically in Hebrew, but then all the other stuff could get translated out. So in the same way that equations, you keep equations in their mathematical form, whereas in the rest of the math textbook will be written in normal English. So the idea is the instructions and stuff can be translated any way you want, but these magical symbols, these magical seals in this Hebrew language has to be maintained. Of course, the degree to which it was maintained is, it wasn't. Yeah, highly questionable. Because again, many of these medieval Latin readers, I think that they maintained it begrudgingly. It's sort of half of them were anti-Semites, but they had to maintain it because they really did believe that it had power, and therefore they had to keep it together. So yeah, it's a funny tradition in this way, and I think that it's and also it's underground, and this is not the kind of thing that you can publicize that you're doing lest you get a visit from the Inquisition. And so all this was done on the sly. So it's not like you're able to, go to a public library and check your magical manual against the official one that everyone reads. You're cutting and scraping things together from what you can find in the necromantic underground, and so it's not like you can really check this against an authoritative version, because if you go requesting a necromantic manual from the Vatican archives, they're going to be, or the cathedral library, they're going to have a real lot of questions about why you want to have access to it. But they did have them. They do survive in those libraries. People think of the Inquisition as a book burning institution, but the Inquisition very rarely burned books. Very, very, very rarely. Sometimes the Dominicans would get a wild hair and burn books, But people should remember the Inquisition was an investigatorial body. They prosecuted crimes, and in order to prosecute crimes, they had to have evidence. And of course, torture was part of that evidence, but also were books. They had to know if they were prosecuting sorcerers, they had to know what sorcerers were up to, and the only way to do that was by seizing these kinds of books and then using them later as part of um, their inquisitorial process. And we know that because we actually have inquisitors' manuals, and they quote extensively from these books.
Was it always underground? Because you mentioned it's underground during like the Inquisition, but prior to that, during its inception, was it still very underground required kind of a thing that was very persecuted against?
It seems that at least exorcism as a form of controlling demons in the Second Temple period probably wasn't so underground. In fact, there's a story in Josephus where Josephus actually witnesses the manipulation of a demon via exorcism in front of Vespasian, the emperor. Like, it's just done in public by an exorcist named Eliezer. Of course, Jesus did most of his exorcism in public as well. And again, it's important to understand, right? Exorcisms are just drawing demons out of people. But if you're an exorcist, you can manipulate them in all kinds of other ways. There are all kinds of other forms of manipulation of demons that are not just taking them out. You can take them out and move them around. For instance, Jesus took them out and put them in pigs, allegedly, had the pigs run off a cliff. It's a great story of the demoniac of Gersara. So yeah, it seems like it goes underground eventually with the rise of Christianity. Christianity has a very negative attitude toward magic, but in Judaism, for instance, Judaism has a much more complicated relationship to the practice of magic, and probably in Jewish circles, it was much less persecuted. Much less persecuted. So this is a difference in terms of religious attitude about what one can get up to in these various religions. And Christianity has a kind of no deal policy, whereas Judaism has a much more complicated relationship with the practice of magic.
And where did they keep all the documents specifically for the Solomonic magic stuff? Because obviously, would they keep them in the church's archives, or would they keep them somewhere separate so the church can have access to them?
So if the church seized it, then it would end up in the inquisitorial archives. But these would be in private libraries. So people did have private libraries. They were often quite small. You're thinking about the Middle Ages. The largest library in Europe was about 2,000 volumes. I mean, so the libraries are utterly unlike what they are now. You might just have it hidden somewhere in your library. It's a good example. We find examples of these in the Medici library. So if you're a pretty powerful family, look, I mean, if you believe in magic, which everyone did, and you're a pretty powerful family of questionable moral values like the Medicis, well, you kind of use whatever you have to get what you want. And so if you're a super powerful family like the Medicis of Borgias, unsurprisingly, we find these kind of manuals in their holdings. Doctors would often have them. Sometimes it's sort of a last resort kind of thing. You'd be like, yeah, we tried everything. I mean, tried everything with medieval medicine, but whatever, they're doing the best they could. But if the idea is that if you tried everything and it didn't work, well, maybe you would try black magic or something. So you would often find these in doctors' libraries was not an uncommon place to find them. So this is the kind of places they would show up. The most famous of these manuals, that's probably not the most famous. One of the more famous of these manuals is a text called CLM 849, the Munich Necromancer's Manual, written sometime around 1450. It ended up in the state archive. So that probably was in a monastery, and then when the monasteries were liquidated, it was all transferred to the state archives. So we're still finding them. They're still finding them. The most famous one is probably the most corrupt, actually, which is somewhat hilarious.
Is that where you find most of the manuscripts, in just people's houses typically?
I mean, monasteries, private people's homes, if they had money, copying books was extraordinarily expensive. You're talking about, the price of a volume, could be up to a year's wages, so again, it's also evidence people believed in this. You wouldn't spend that much money on something you thought was, malarkey. People really did believe in these things. But yeah, learned people's libraries, monastic libraries. Again, who's copying and doing this stuff? It's priests. So these would be in cathedral libraries, monastic libraries. There were some priests that moved around, so it might be the manual they took with them, in addition to the Bible or whatever else they had. But yeah, a lot of these survive, which is about 150 manuscripts of just this one text, the Clavicula Solomonis. Just that one book exists in about 150 libraries, or 150 different manuscripts. So popular, to say the very least.
What are some of the things that you find most interesting about your research in Solomonic magic?
I think the most interesting things are, from a philosophical point of view, it's how medieval people thought the world worked. Um, they didn't think of themselves as one 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 group of people alone, right? That they really thought of the world as being populated by angels and demons. So it gives us a glimpse into the world that they thought they lived in, which of course we look at now as ridiculous. But it also is always a good mirror to hold up to ourselves and ask ourselves what kind of strange suppositions we're also carrying around. I think what's also interesting about it is just thinking about it from a sociological and manuscript production. How do forbidden ideas, how do transgressive ideas, how do ideas that shouldn't be able to make it? And it also disrupts our idea of the Middle Ages, which we think of as being, we think of being very monolithic, very pious, very Catholic. Everyone's kind of on the same page, and the story we tell, right, is everybody's on the same page. Then Martin Luther came around and busted everything up, and blah 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 blah. What turns out, things aren't monolithic. People are complicated. People are willing to break rules, and so it just gives us a more complicated glimpse into the actuality of the Middle Ages, as opposed to when most people think of the Middle Ages, they're thinking that everyone's just reading Thomas Aquinas or something like that. And people were, but they were doing other things too, and so it just complicates our vision of what the Middle Ages were, in a lot of ways. Also, they're just fun. I mean, again, I don't believe in any of this stuff. I don't practice this stuff. I don't believe that there are such things as demons. Um, but it's just fun. It's like reading, I play Dungeons and Dragons, so it's like reading an actual monsters manual. And so in
Harry
that way,
Potter?
it's just, yeah, or Harry Potter or whatever. It's just fun to read this stuff. And so I don't know. I think people often think of academia as being quite boring, because it is often quite boring. But I get the small sliver of things where it's like, oh yeah, I get to work on a necromancer's manual, or something like that. So it's, in that way, it's just a lot of fun. I tell you, it's a lot more fun than sitting around reading Duns Scotus all day, which I love Scotus as much as the next guy, but that stuff is tiring, compared to, here's how you get a demon to find buried treasure for you. So I think it's just a lot more, fun in a lot of ways.
Have you ever been tempted to try it?
No, I mean, I just don't. I mean, and this is a thing that I often wonder about to people who are modern practitioners of this stuff. Which, again, one of the more famous modern practitioners of this stuff is a piece of literature called the Goetia, which is a pretty common text that modern occultists use to summon demons. And part of what's the right word? What perplexes me about it is that these medieval texts assume a medieval worldview. They assume medieval metaphysics. They assume a medieval universe, right? They assume that you live in a universe with the Earth at the center, and between the Earth and the Moon is a bunch of demons, and you can pull them down using divine names. No one believes in that anymore, or no one should. Um, and so it's often perplexing to me that when some people ask, like, well, do you think it could work, or have you tried it? And I'm like, I couldn't try it, not because I'm not because I'm, there's lots of reasons why I wouldn't. But one of the reasons why I couldn't is because the mechanics that it assumes have been proven untrue. So it's one of those things where it's like, I don't know, it's like a good analogy. It's like, have you tried to convert lead into gold? I'm like, no, I'm not going to try to convert lead into gold, because that's chemically impossible. Alchemy was just theoretically wrong, and therefore it could never do what it pretended to do, or wanted to do. It's not because the alchemists were stupid. They were careful experimentalists. They just had a fundamentally wrong theory of nature. So it doesn't make any sense for me to try to go convert lead to gold chemically in a modern chemistry lab, because that's chemically impossible. And for the same reasons that I think that summoning demons who live just below the moon doesn't make any sense anymore, because that's not how the universe works.
You mentioned how one of the things you found interesting was the sociological means by which ideas can be passed on that you said shouldn't have been passed on, or you should have expected to have failed?
Yeah, or ideas that are banned. And this is an interesting thing, and I think this has a lot to do with just, the transmission of ideas that are socially unacceptable is a fascinating trend. And of course, we're seeing it now on the internet, right? With the previous iteration of the so-called intellectual dark web, or ideas which are transgressive of either one political bent or the other. And so it's quite interesting that when an idea is forbidden, it doesn't mean it stops being transferred. It just means it gets transferred in weird ways. And so I'm curious often from a philosophical point of view, and that's my training. I have a background in philosophy. I'm often curious about how transgressive ideas get transmitted because inherently they shouldn't be. And so it's fascinating to look at the Middle Ages where not only was it a transgressive idea, but it was a set of ideas and practices that could have got you killed, and yet they proliferated. What explains that exactly? And we don't know. One answer could be that the church simply turned the blind eye to this. They knew it was happening and they just didn't feel like enforcing the rules. Or if they felt like enforcing the rules, they would have to really gut a huge layer of their own administration because half people were up to doing this stuff or something. This is also the time of the witch trials and everything else. So, just from the point of view of how do illicit ideas move, and what are the selection pressures for ideas? We talked earlier about the fact that this doesn't work. I mean, it just can't. It's not the way the universe functions, I think. Well, why did it survive for so long? Well, what are the selection pressures for ideas to survive? And it turns out them working is just one selection pressure. And what is constitutive of working? And so I find that those kinds of selection pressures for idea structures to be just fascinating, whether it's the 1350s or the 2020s.
Were people executed for doing this kinds of magic?
Rarely, rarely, and it's because you have to understand that the witch trials and witch hunters, inquisitors, and ecclesiastical executioners are all doing very different things. So the Inquisition, depending on where you were, did all kinds of things. It wasn't necessarily, in fact, it was never mandated to go hunt down sorcery. It was meant to hunt down heresy. Those are different things, with the exception of the witch trials in which heresy and sorcery are combined. And that's why the witch trials were so much more lethal than sorcery trials. Sorcery is just a sin. If you committed a sin like adultery or, I don't know, drunkenness, you would just go and confess and they'd give you some penance and it'd be done with. It was also true of the Inquisition in some ways too. So sorcery was just a sin. The difference between sorcery and witchcraft, at least in the Middle Ages, was that witchcraft was considered a heresy, and that could get you killed a lot faster. Almost all the cases in which a person is arrested for sorcery and then executed, it's almost always some other reason why they're being executed. So the most famous example is Cecco d'Ascoli. Cecco d'Ascoli was convicted eventually of criminal necromancy and he was burned alive in the 14th century. Well, he'd also mucked up some political relationships and made some people pretty angry at him. And so it probably has just as much to do with the fact that he pissed a bunch of people off who had a lot of power, and they just had the excuse now to execute him. So the witch trials resulted in between 40 and 60,000 people, overwhelmingly women, being executed. But you can count on two hands how many people were executed in the Middle Ages. Men were executed for sorcery. Although it's worth mentioning that in Iceland and in Russia, more men were executed as witches than women were.
And you mentioned there were the three kinds: the witch hunters, the inquisitioners, and you said ecclesiastical executioners or
Yeah,
something. What is that?
So ecclesiastical executioners are where you would be in a situation where you would be put on you would be subject to a capital crime, and the ecclesiastical authorities would convict you. They would give you penances, but they would turn you over to the secular authorities, and then the secular authorities would have a separate trial, and typically they would put you on to death penalty. So the church never technically executed anyone. They're not allowed to do that. So what they did was they would find you guilty of an ecclesiastical crime and then relax you, which is the technical term. They'd relax you over to the secular bodies, and the secular bodies could execute you, because it was also illegal by secular law to engage in witchcraft or sorcery because, well, Um, all kinds of reasons for that. But the Inquisition, I mean, people can say what they want to about the Inquisition. They were a careful body, and they were actually far less lethal than people often think. Which again is interesting in terms of again we have this idea that it's burning people constantly, but the Inquisition was actually a much more careful body, really prosecuted these crimes. And again, the Spanish Inquisition had a very different job than the Roman Inquisition. These are very different inquisitorial bodies.
What was the strangest thing you came across from Solomonic magic?
The strangest thing. There's a lot of like bringing dead people back to life and stuff like that, or not really bringing them back to life. You can't bring them back to life. You can only make them talk. Only God can bring people back from the dead, so you weren't allowed to do that. It's good stuff. Some of the most interesting things. I mean, I guess most stuff is just kind of comical. It's like summoning an illusory banquet. I guess one of the more funny things, and I guess when I say interesting, I think of funny. There was a great there's a necromancer's manual found in Bavaria, where the necromancer says that he summoned an entire army to like terrify the Holy Roman Emperor, and then the Holy Roman Emperor and all of his knights freaked out, and they were amazed by this necromancer, and then he summoned them like a breakfast the next day, and they all ate breakfast together. Which I don't know, it always reminds me of the episode of Chappelle's Show where they're playing basketball against Prince, and he serves them pancakes the next day. I don't know. So it's just these funny stories. Like I don't think that really happened, but yeah, I think those kind of stories are just interesting. They give us interesting insights into the psychology of the people doing this stuff. And also interesting insights into the psychology of what they wanted to be able to do. They wanted to be able to like, control the Holy Roman Emperor and like show out how powerful they were. So again, it shows you, gives us some insight into these people. But I mean, some of the demons are interesting, I guess. They have surprising powers. Like there's a demon that can teach you ethics, which I always found to be ironic. I like the idea that you would go, I don't know what right and wrong is. I mean, go find, like if you're summoning demons to learn ethics, we're already learning something about you. So I just find that to be, I don't know. Again, there's some combination of humor in there as well, which I just find wonderful.
Are there any notable examples of people using these kinds of magics with world leaders, Napoleon, Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun? Anything like did world leaders hire necromancers or whatever to do things?
Yeah, we do see some examples where they would, where the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II surrounded himself with these people. He was infamous for surrounding himself with magicians and sorcerers and all kinds of things. We know that powerful families had books like this, so they must have had someone there doing it. I don't know. Nancy Reagan had an astrologer. Yeah, the Reagans, not only did they have an astrologer, but they actually used astrology to like decide geopolitical God. So yeah, I think that or you think about the Tsar and his family was all wrapped up with Rasputin, which I think one of my favorite stories from that whole period was when when Lenin took control of Russia. One of the first things he released was all of the secret all the secret files, and one of them was the files that they kept on Rasputin. And he just thought of him, it's like Rasputin comes home to the Tsarina's house, very drunk. He does this, very drunk. So it was great to have that stuff released. But yeah, I think that powerful people who want to maintain power often get wrapped up in this kind of stuff. And whether it's the Reagans or the Tsars or whoever, I suspect that, yeah, I'm sure they're some of them are knee deep in it. I can't imagine Napoleon would have any time of the day for this stuff. He was a rationalist. Napoleon was a child of the Enlightenment, if there ever were one. So I think that he would have gladly confined this stuff to the fire if he could.
Awesome. Brendy, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. Can you just check? Can you hear us all right? Can you hear? Does it sound good?
Yes, I can hear.
All right. Well, the reason I wanted to bring you on is because Brenda has a very interest in magic and things, and she had some questions and interest in talking with you about Solomonic magic and how it relates to other kinds of magic that she has an interest in. So, Brenda, what kind of questions did you have about Solomonic magic?
I think 30 questions.
I'd be here for a while.
Yeah. The first question I had was, what is Solomonic magic?
Yeah, so we talked about that a little bit earlier. It's any magical tradition attributed to Solomon, typically involving the manipulation of demons.
And you said angels were involved also?
Angels are sometimes involved. Most forms of Solomonic magic typically deal with manipulating demonic beings. You don't typically get to manipulate angels in European Christian magic, because those are being directed by God, and so you can't. In the same way that I couldn't tell a Marine what to do, like I don't have chain of command, with a Marine. I don't have chain of command with an angel, but because of me being a Christian, which I'm not, but if being a good Christian in good standing, I do have the ability to manipulate demons, because that's established in the New Testament that a believer can compel demons to do things, and therefore one could do that if one saw fit.
And yes, TJump, I am using Safari. I source I could use. Should I try joining back in?
Yeah, try opening it up with Chrome, because you're lagging a little bit. There's like a delay between your voice and your lips moving.
Guys.
It's the demons.
It is the demons.
It's the demons.
So what got you into researching Solomonic magic?
It's my job. I mean, I'm an academic studying esotericism. Magic's is part of that. And, I can't say that, frankly, I'm not that interested in magic in terms of my own specific interests. I'm mostly interested in the sort of metaphysical underpinnings of some of this stuff. The magic stuff is frankly often quite tiresome, but I think what got me into this stuff in general is just, I grew up on a steady diet of shows like Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World and Leonard Nimoy on In Search Of. And I think that there are two basic things that can happen to you if you grow up on that kind of stuff. Either you can like become a believer and you're like a History Channel person, or conspiracy theory, or believe in it, or you can become a complete skeptic and lose all interest. I did both. I maintained interest and became a skeptic. And, that led to basically me going to the only academic institution, in the world that studies this stuff from an academic point of view. It's the University of Amsterdam.
And you mentioned that what interested you was the metaphysical underpinnings. What are those?
So looking at how medieval people or modern people look at how the world functions. So what do you have to believe in metaphysically, right, for magic to function? And so do you have to believe in hidden forces? And what do those hidden forces look like? And what is the relationship between language and being? Of course, now since Ferdinand de Saussure, we think that the relationship between language and being is arbitrary, that there is no connection between language and being. Well, medieval people didn't think that. Most people don't think that. And so when you begin asking yourself, why do some words have magical powers and some words don't? Well, because there's a metaphysics of language there, and that metaphysics of language, informs how this stuff is supposed to work. So it also is linked up to how people conceive of the world philosophically. And then what happens when that changes? What happens when we go through modernity and people still continue to believe in things like this? When we live in, the 21st century, what does it mean? What would it mean to believe in anything like this? That's an interesting question. So, also how does the official metaphysics being taught at the University of Paris, like by Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus or William of Ockham, how does that track to what people are doing on the ground? Because just because Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus or William of Ockham are up there teaching X, Y, and Z, doesn't mean that anyone's listening to them, right? They can write as big a books as they like. And how many people are out there reading the Critique of Pure Reason, or just because we say it's influential, does that really mean it's influential, or does that mean it's influential to like 10 guys? So what impact does this stuff have? And what impact did it have on common people? What did it have in our different layers of the intellectual world? This, the intellectual world of the Middle Ages is much like the intellectual world now. It's not one uniform block. So those are the kinds of things that interest me when I'm looking at these texts. I'm trying to read between the lines to see what do people have to believe in order to be practicing this stuff at all. And that's true of anything else. What do you have to believe in to believe things about gender or class or you know what does it mean for people to believe in astrology now? And how does that work with a modern worldview about about what stars are? So that's quite perplexing, but it's interesting.
So you mentioned astrology. Do you think there are a lot of comparisons, similarities between astrology and other kinds of magic with Solomonic magic?
Of course, yeah. I mean um, the you have to understand that the way that medieval people imagine the stars is they radiated a kind of energy, and that energy could be manipulated. And in fact, depending on how that energy got radiated down to here, affected all kinds of things down here, which is a totally reasonable belief to have in the Middle Ages. I mean, if you've studied the moon cycle and the tides, you clearly see a relation, and there's a causal relation there. And medieval people just said, yeah, well, there's all kinds of things. Astral bodies must be manipulating all kinds of things. So it's a pretty reasonable thing to believe. And therefore, the idea was in order to manipulate these beings or do much of anything of importance, you have to have timed it correctly with all these astrological things. In the same way that if you didn't time, I don't know, setting sail with the tides, you would not be a very good ship pilot. If you didn't time, I don't know, using a demon to find you buried treasure with all the other astrological things going on up there, you wouldn't be a very good magical practitioner. So, yeah, I mean, these magical practitioners used all of the sciences available to them, which, of course, in the Middle Ages, astrology was taught as a science along with all kinds of other things, in the interest of making this stuff effective. Which, again, we can dismiss the merits of astrology as a failed kind of science, but in the Middle Ages, it was all the rage.
So, like, what are there different patterns of different kinds of magics that were originated from different cultures? Are there different genres, unique things that happen specific to specific cultures relative to why that culture adopted this kind of magic?
Yeah, I mean, and also cultural diffusion. So, for instance, the Alexandrian pagan culture was taken over by Christianity, and that culture was taken over by Islam. So you have cultural diffusion, not just laterally through time, but also vertically through cultural diffusion, conquest. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a reason why there's all this stuff in Hebrew. There's clearly Jewish magic being practiced, and some of that's being transferred to the Christians. Astral magic was practiced by the late classical pagans. That was transferred to the Muslims, and they greatly improved upon it, I suppose, is one word one can use. So yeah, we can definitely see very clearly culturally specific forms of magic. For instance, the creation of golems is a very artificial humanoids is a very particular Jewish form of magic practiced by Kabbalists. You don't see that in Christianity. Christianity thought that it was an outrage. Only God can create people, or something like that.
Awesome.
Astral magic also more typical in the Islamic world. Someone like Al-Kindi, although now there's debate about whether Al-Kindi actually even wrote some of these books of astral magic. I think he didn't. But yeah, those are the kinds of things that we can definitely see diffusion through cultures and the cultural origins of various forms of magical practice, some of which go back to the late classical pagan world.
Were there any fusions of other kinds of magics into Solomonic magic where they had a transition between lots of different kinds of techniques?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when scholars talk about a distinction between, for instance, Solomonic magic and non-Solomonic magic, that distinction is artificial. Medieval people didn't make those distinctions. They weren't like, I'm a Solomonic magician or I'm an astral magician. They cobbled together all kinds of things. And so when we talk about these distinctions, when you get down to really, really granular detail, they begin to break down. And so, although in alchemy, you do see more clearly, there are schools of alchemy that really try to maintain some intellectual distinctiveness, but magic, I mean, and there's a huge amount of cross pollination between the various schools of magic, and through the Middle Ages, which is unsurprising, right? It's a practical art. They're trying to make it work, and if you're trying to make something work, you're not going to get yourself pigeonholed in some dogmatic belief that only this kind of thing works. You're going to be experimenting with whatever you can, and they experimented widely.
That seems like intellectual honesty. You should be able to experiment widely to see what works. That's the correct way to do things. You mentioned there's a modern version of Solomonic magic. Are there modern practitioners?
There are a great number of people who are out there summoning demons. The dominant texts that people are used now, one's called the Key of Solomon, which was published by MacGregor Mathers in the late 19th century from a badly corrupt French manuscript in the Bibliothèque Arsenal in Paris. Which is funny because that text has gone on to great popularity among ritual practitioners, despite the fact that it's among the worst in terms of corruption. Sometimes first to the race, you win. So that is that text. The other text that's quite popular is a text called the Lesser Key of Solomon, the Goetia, which is one text, and that text was popularized by the British occultist Aleister Crowley. Although that text is quite late, it only really appears in English, which is interesting, not in Latin, and it appears quite late in the only appearing as late as the 17th century. It's the last layer of this kind of material to emerge. But there are people out there summoning, I don't know, Paimon, who's, if you've seen Hereditary, the movie, Paimon is a pretty famous demon these days, and people are definitely out there. You go to the occult subreddit, there are people out there asking for advice for summoning various demons to do various kinds of things. So your mileage may vary.
Awesome. Brandy, please continue with your questions. Hopefully your tech issues are
I'm
fixed.
back. Sorry. Okay. So my second question is, did Solomon get in contact with these demons and angels?
How did he?
Yeah.
So the earliest texts that we have about him making contact with these creatures are legends from a text called the Testament of Solomon, but also some early Jewish text as well. So it's important to understand that for ancient people, spirits and demons and all kinds of things were just out there. We think of them as kind of exotic, but ancient people just sort of thought of them as like, when you go to the bathroom, there's a bathroom demon. So don't hang out in there, because there's the demons in the bathroom. It was like, this is like how ubiquitous this belief was. Ruins, you don't go in ruins; they're infested with demons. It's so. The first thing to know is that these beings were just thought to be really, really common. And how did you get in touch with them? How did Solomon get in touch with them? Well, he was building the temple, and the legend goes that the temple couldn't be built, and the Jerusalem temple couldn't be built of any stones that were hewn. So metal wasn't allowed to touch those stones. Well, it doesn't take an architectural genius to realize you're not building a giant ass building with a bunch of unhewn stones. It's not going to happen. You have to get them hewn somehow or the other. So there's this long legend that develops where Solomon used various kinds of angels and demons to eventually get a special kind of worm. I'm not kidding. It's a special kind of worm called the Shamir worm. And the Shamir worm was able to cut stones without using metal to do it. And so this Shamir worm was what Solomon was after, and ultimately he had to manipulate the king of the demons, a demon named Ashmedai, to get it. And so what ends up happening is you get this body of literature, this folklore literature, and then if you have Solomon using all kinds of techniques to get magical worms and stuff, people are naturally going to ask, like, well, how do I get a magical worm? And then you begin to get people sort of filling in the gaps about how to do all this stuff. So we see a long arc of narrative arc, and then here's the various kinds of demons he was contacting, and here's how you can contact them too. And that's where you get the literature goes from legendary literature and folklore to practical magic, and that occurs sometime like Byzantine period, maybe a little earlier.
Okay.
But he had a magic ring. Another thing. Yeah, he had a magic ring. I'm sure folks have seen the Star of David. The Star of David originated as not the Star of David, but as the seal of Solomon. And it was used, that was the image that he used to manipulate demons. So it's the first time that the Star of David shows up on stuff, often it's magical things. It's things to ward off demons. It becomes sort of a generic anti-demon image, and it kind of sticks. And that's how the Star of David, the Magen David, the Shield of David, comes into Jewish iconography.
Oh, wow, that is interesting.
Yeah, you can say what you want about all this stuff. It is if nothing else, it is interesting. Again, I think of it like reading Dungeons and Dragons manuals.
Ah, you know,
Except for
I've never really played Dungeons and Dragons. Land.
it's fun.
Sweet. Okay, so influence other various types of alchemy and religion. So how did that influence the whole like culture spin on that?
I couldn't quite hear the question. It was the audio was a little broken.
Oh, that's fine. How did magic influence other various types of alchemy, witchcraft, or religion?
So religion it had a pretty big impact on. I mean, it's derivative of religion, I guess. I mean, again, I think we should not juxtapose magic and religion. We should think of them as operating within similar kind of overlapping spheres. With alchemy, the alchemists were desperate not to be associated with people like that. The alchemists were really careful experimentalists. So they, that's the way to put this. They worked really hard to differentiate themselves from conjurers. In the Middle Ages, there was what was called the art versus nature debate. And the art versus nature debate was, can you improve upon nature, or has God made everything the way that it should be? We still have this debate about GMOs and stuff, like you're playing God by, I don't know, taking the seeds out of bananas or something. But the idea was, should you be manipulating nature in some deep fundamental way? And the alchemist said, sure, you should. God made us smart, and God has made the world this way. So we like manipulate things all the time. Like we make bronze and stuff. So we can do all kinds of things, and we should be able to do things by art. Well, people like Thomas Aquinas did not like that, and said basically you should leave the world the way that God made it and don't tinker with things too much. So the alchemists did not want to be associated with the sorcerers, because the sorcerers were, one, criminals, and two, alchemy always had a very perilous existence in Europe. The theologians are always against it. It was never taught in the universities, and it was never protected by guilds. So alchemists were sort of freelancers, and they did not want to be associated with magicians. And so typically they worked really hard to distinguish themselves from alchemists. And you don't see much in the way of magic blended in with alchemy. It's very, very rare. Very rare. Much more likely with astrology than with alchemy. Yeah. So people wanted to be quarantined from being accused of sorcery, because once you were accused of sorcery, and if you were brought into the illegal proceedings for it, it was really hard to undo that process. So also witchcraft is very different than sorcery. So this is a strange thing to say, but there were no witches in the Middle Ages. The people prosecuted for witchcraft never committed witchcraft. There's virtually no evidence of this. But there were people who were folk healers and other kinds of what we call cunning folk who did do what we would call magical healing, but they didn't want to be associated with people summoning demons either. So, this is the kind of range of things that existed. Most people did not want to be associated with people mucking about with demons, because it was illegal. It was, and the consequences were quite dire. They would burn you with wet wood. To burn you longer.
Oh, wow. Okay. No, I definitely don't want to be burned with wet wood. God.
Yeah, I would pass on that as well.
So what is alchemy exactly? It seems like it's chemistry, maybe?
It is. I mean, alchemy is a pre-modern theory of nature in which that accepted basically a version of Aristotle's physics with some manipulation. And what the basic idea was is that if, insofar as Aristotle was right, which he wasn't, he was basically always wrong. He was systematically wrong, though. That's very important. People will make fun of Aristotle for being wrong with it. He was at least systematically wrong, and that's very important. That's very different than most people. Most people are just wrong in all kinds of random, crappy ways. But Aristotle had a theory of nature, which, if you know, the nature was fundamentally composed of earth, air, fire, and water. And the idea was that there must be some material, there must be some neutral substrate that underlies all of those. And that material, that substrate, right, ousia, being or substance. The idea was if you could decompose something back into that substrate and then subject it to the similar kinds of procedures or similar kinds of processes that go on deep inside the earth, then you could, if one, then one could decompose it back into its substrate and then recompose it as something else. So you could decompose lead, and then you could recompose it into gold or silver. And the basic theory that developed in the Islamic period was that all metals were some combination of mercury and sulfur, and that by manipulating the ratio of mercury to sulfur using various kinds of techniques like distillation and sublimation and calcination, you could alter that fundamental substance into something else. Now, I know that sounds crazy. People look at that theory now and say, why would anyone believe that all metals are made of mercury and sulfur? Well, I'll give you an example of why they believed it. They were experimenting. If you find lead in nature, you never find just elemental lead. You don't find elemental anything hardly. You find alloys in the earth. And so the most common alloy that you would find in the earth of lead, one of the most common in general, would be stibnite. Or rather not stibnite, galena. If you take galena, right, which is the most common form that lead appears in, and you just take galena and put it in a crucible and heat it, and smell that, you'll smell sulfur coming off because galena is iron sulfide, right? Or lead sulfide. You'll smell the sulfur coming off. And if you melt lead down, which you can melt lead down over a campfire, it looks a lot like mercury. And so when the alchemists were doing experiments, they were like, this is what things are made of. In fact, most, right, of this, and another example of this, you take that same galena and you put into a smelting vessel, and you heat it really hot, much hotter, twice as hot as you would use to melt down lead. The lead oxidizes. And guess what? Galena contains almost always a small amount of silver. Now, if you're a person in the pre-modern period and you're like, this is really weird. I took a substance, heated it really hot, and then I heated it even more. The original substance vanished, actually just absorbed into the cupel or into the cupellation furnace. But then it turned into silver somehow. Right? Now they didn't know that it was silver in there, but they thought it turned into silver, which is a completely reasonable thing to believe at some level. This is why the alchemists did what they did. They had experimental reasons to believe that you could convert lead into silver. Well, if you convert lead into silver, why not convert it into gold? Well, you have to figure out how to do that. And how do you do it? Well, you have to subject it to similar kind of processes, just like it's subjected to in the earth. So that's what alchemists did. There's a lot of reasons why we transitioned from alchemy to chemistry. We get into that, but that is what the alchemists were up to. And there's a persistent idea now that alchemy is about inner transformation and about psychology. Those are 19th and 20th century romantic revisions of what the alchemists were actually up to. They were absolutely trying to convert metals into each other. We know that because we have their books and we have their experimental logs. Not a single one of them ever says things like, yeah, and I'm trying to find my higher self in some kind of new agey thing. Like, medieval people didn't talk like that. In fact, I'm not even sure they had subjectivity the way that we have now. I'm skeptical of that even. So even the idea of like self-help it's a super modern idea that medieval people didn't think about that kind of stuff.
I thought that's what alchemy was in the first place, but
only now. you can basically lay that idea at the feet of two people. One of them is named Marion Atwood, who published a book called the um, Dissertation on the Hermetic Mysteries. So she pioneered that idea in the early 19th century, and the psychological reinterpretation of alchemy can be laid at the feet of Carl Jung. And it's really from those two that alchemy as self-transformation took hold. But I have the copy of the 1609, 1619 six-volume Theatrum Chemicum, which is the largest compilation of alchemical literature ever published. And they don't talk about self-help. They talk about lead sulfide, or what we now call lead sulfide, or subjecting gold, converting gold to breaking gold down using aqua regia and stuff like that. So it's a very different kind. And people think, well, they have this cool symbolism and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, they did, because they had trade secrets, and they encoded their techniques using this elaborate system of imagery. But we still use a relatively elaborate system of imagery and codes to represent chemistry now. If I go show my 4-year-old a chemistry textbook, it'll be completely perplexing to them, even though they understand all those letters and numbers. In the same way that if a non-alchemist looks at an alchemy text, it'll be perplexing, but not because the alchemy is weird. It's because we don't know how to read it anymore.
Got it. So, do you believe that magic is actually real? Some Solomonic magic yourself?
I mean, I believe it's a historical reality, but I don't think there are demons. And insofar as I don't believe that there are demons, I don't think one can manipulate them. Also, I would say that this is a thing that also I mentioned. This is more true of angels, actually. Anyone who's interested in manipulating angels and demons hasn't read anything about angels and demons, especially angels. They're just horrifying. Angels are just nightmarish. I wouldn't want to have anything to do with it. In the same way that I wouldn't bring a bear in my house, I wouldn't bring an angel or demon in my house either. And so I don't know. It also just tells me that maybe people don't really believe what they're doing, or they're real reckless, or both. I wouldn't bring a bear or a tiger in my house, in the same way that I wouldn't bring a demon or an angel in either. But that's why there are all these elaborate techniques for binding them and protecting yourself from them, I suppose. But no, I don't think that they're real. And at the same time, if I did think they were real, I would avoid them at all costs.
So you're talking about binding. So how would they bind demons and angels?
So a couple of ways, more than a couple. Typically, you would use divine names to bind them. So the demons don't like the names of God, and you can use the names of God to torture them, which is fun. You can use magic. You can use magic circles. Again, we don't think of geometry as having inherent supernatural power anymore, but ancient medieval people did, and so certain geometric shapes had power, and therefore you could use those geometric shapes to bind them, to trap them, basically. And you could also use various kinds of these creatures were weak against certain kinds of things. So, for instance, all demons are terrified of iron, according to Michael Sellis, at least. Now, you could also use sulfurous gas to manipulate them. They don't like the smell of that, because no one does. And you can use various kinds of things like silver to manipulate them as well, silver and gold and various kinds of things. So there's all kinds of techniques for basically capturing them, putting them into a trap, and then torturing them to get them to do what you want. Solomonic magic is very brutal in this way. Now, I don't know to what degree you're supposed to have sympathy for demons or not, if they're fallen angels or whatever, and they kind of get what's coming to them. But which is very different, and that's a different theory of demons in Christianity versus Judaism, or Islam for that matter. But the idea basically is to capture them, torture them, and get them to do what you want. And that's how Solomonic magic works. In fact, there's a whole backlash and sort of modern magic, where the idea of torturing them is considered immoral, and therefore they think Solomonic magic is like canceled, because You shouldn't be torturing poor demons. But
Oh,
yeah, I mean, I don't know how I can. I guess it depends on what you think they are in terms of what you think you can do to them. But again, this is also the Middle Ages. Middle Ages were also a time period where Thomas Aquinas thought you could just do whatever you wanted to animals because they were created by God to be servants of human beings. So if you wanted to beat a donkey for no reason, or fight animals for fun, you could do that because God created all these animals for our entertainment or for us to manipulate and use them. We have a very different understanding of our relationship to non-human animals now, and maybe we should have a different understanding of how to treat demons. But that's what you do. You capture them, you torture them, and you get them to do what you want.
got it. So, demon immortal, right? What do you
They
think?
are immortal, but they do experience pain.
Like constant?
No, not constant pain. I mean, they will later when they're cast into hell, according to Christian theology. But right now, they're given providence over the world to go and do evil things to people. Um, yeah, so the main text we have to describe sort of demon anatomy and physiology, as much as we have a text like that, is Michael Sellis's book on demons. And he describes them to be made of a very fine substance, that they're physical beings. They're actually made of stuff. But the stuff that they're made of is a very fine material. And because they're made of this very fine material, you can like cut them with a sword. That's why they're scared of iron.
Mhm.
And so they feel all the agony of being cut in half. But in the same way that you can run your hand through air or run your hand through water, the water immediately rushes back together. So the demon rushes back together and is rejoined, but they feel all the experience of being cut in half or hurt with iron. And if you ever see medieval images of necromancers, medieval books, they almost always have a sword. And even to this day, ceremonial practitioners of magic will often have a dagger with them. And that dagger, FMA, is basically used to threaten and cajole demons to get them to do what you want because they're scared of being, I don't know, stabbed and stuff.
Okay.
So yeah, they're creatures. I mean, Thomas Aquinas wrote a book called On Spiritual Creatures, and he goes at lengths to talk about the properties of these beings. But yeah, they're not. When he said they're spirits, we shouldn't think of them as immaterial. They're just made of a very different than material than you and I are. They're much more similar to air than they are like flesh and blood, obviously. But they are made of something. Medieval people were much more materialist than people think. Even spirit was a kind of very fine matter.
That's really interesting. So with that going on, you said and like symbols to like bind them or hold these demons. So how does that work exactly?
So one of the ways that you can bind a demon was by learning its secret name. So or learning its signature, its seal. So um, medieval people, ancient people, believed that there was a continuum between language and metaphysics. That is to say, being and language were connected. They're intimately connected. Some people still have this idea. Like some people won't say words like cancer because they think that if they say it, they'll make it more possible or something. There's still a hangover from the idea that language and metaphysics are connected. Since Ferdinand de Saussure, we don't believe that anymore. I say we, modern semioticians, don't typically believe that. Well, medieval people did believe it. They believed that the world was intimately related, metaphysically connected to language. And because it was connected to language, and language understood broadly speaking, if you understood a name of something, if you got the name of something, you could manipulate that thing. And so the idea was, if you knew the name of a demon or its seal, they don't typically write their name in Latin. They have a seal in the same way that a king would have a seal. And if you got that seal, then you could manipulate them. And so learning those seals, in fact, these books are filled with these demonic seals. In fact, they're of great antiquity sometimes. You'll often see little ringlets attached to linear lines connected to each other. We could pull an image of one of these up. Those date back to the Greek magical papyri. I mean, they go back thousands of years, 1,000 years. It's amazing the degree to which there's cultural continuity with the iconography of magic. But the idea is, if you learn their name, then you can manipulate them. And if you read the New Testament, that's exactly what Jesus does. When Jesus comes in contact with a possessed person, the first thing he does is tell them, "You got to come out of there. And what's your name?" And you can think about the name of the Gerasene demoniac, right? Legion. And once Jesus learns the name of the demon, he can then manipulate them and throw them out. And so this idea of learning the secret name of a demon is how you would manipulate them. And their names often took the form of these strange seal devices. We have tons and tons and tons of these that have survived.
And students were like bind it or hold it. Would the sorcerer or the person using Solomonic magics, because I heard there was these folklore like stories about each demon, and they all have like a.
I'm sorry, the last part broke up again.
Because you were talking about how each demon has a like a story or a profile on them.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that come to be?
It came about because the way that people, so in Christian mythology, the demons are all fallen angels, right? That's not true in Jewish demonology. There's a totally different mythology in Judaism. But the idea was that all of these angels, right? They had jobs. God created them to do stuff. So you'd have an angel in charge of this and an angel in charge of that. The angels up there pushing the planets around. The world's a very busy place in this mentality. And some of the angels that fell, they knew all kinds of stuff. For instance, they might know about metallurgy or making cosmetics, or they might know about herbalism, right? This is from the Book of Enoch. And the idea is that all of these demons, they were trained up because they basically were given jobs by God, and that once they fell, they retained all that knowledge. And they were kind of like encyclopedias, like if you want to learn about herbalism, you get rid of this demon. Or if you want to learn about metallurgy, you get with that demon. Metallurgy always had an air of mysticism to it. People often associated blacksmiths with magic as well. It is quite magical what they do and did in the Middle Ages. Quite impressive. And so the idea was these demons had learned this because they had been basically programmed to do all these jobs by God. And then they just happened to muck it up and get kicked out. So just because you get kicked out of the club doesn't mean you forget everything. But now they're kind of like mercenaries, and you can like manipulate them and get their knowledge by binding them with these things. So yeah, there are catalogs of demons, and we call them demonological catalogs. The most famous is a text called the Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonorum, and the idea was that you could that people had contacted them, they'd learned about them, they'd learned which demon does what, and then you could go through these catalogs or these encyclopedias basically and pick the demon that you needed to, I don't know, teach you metallurgy or what have you.
So is there a demon hierarchy? Like
in some texts, yeah, and unsurprisingly, it looks very much like a medieval hierarchy, right? Just feudalism in the sky. Yeah, you have some texts have the demons organized by sort of feudal rank. So you would have barons and dukes and lords and all kinds of things like that. Which is funny because if you get these texts in France, they follow the French feudal system, and in Germany, they follow the German one. Because human beings aren't making this stuff as they go or anything. Yeah, so some texts have them organized basically as in terms of like medieval feudalism, because that's what medieval people, that's how they organize their world. But yeah, they're often organized like this. You'll talk about a duke and he'll have 600 attendants and he'll have this many knights, and it's just medieval people organizing demons in the same way that society was organized. So you would get a baron of hell or whatever. I don't know. It sounds like Doom or something. I think they did have Dukes of Hell and Doom, but yeah, you have this. Again, I think the most famous text of this is pseudo-monarchia daemonorum, the false monarchy of the gods, or the demons rather. So yeah, they get organized that way. The organization's all over the place. Sometimes you could be a duke in one text and a baron in the other, or sometimes you'll be high up the chain in one text and then down the chain in another. It all depends on which text you got.
What is by far the like demon folklore story or profile you've read?
What's the what?
Most interesting demon profile you read on?
I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier. Did you jump? I like the demon. There's a demon in the Goetia that teaches you ethics, which I like that idea. I just find that to be hilarious. So I like that idea. I mean, not that being evil means you don't have knowledge of good and evil. Clearly, you have to have some knowledge of it. So I like that one. I always like anything dealing with treasure. I like demons associated with treasure, and there's a whole genre of treasure magic that existed in the Middle Ages. So I'm very interested in that, because I just like, I don't know, the Goonies or something. So I like that stuff. I mean, the original story of Solomon is just like a comic book. I always tell people that, there's a moment where like Solomon and Ashmedai, who is the king of the demons in Jewish folklore, his name's Persian actually, which is interesting. It shows you that Jewish demonology, there was no demonology for the Israelites. The Israelites didn't believe in demons much, and they didn't actually have hell or heaven. Those ideas are all imported basically from Zoroastrianism. And the first demons we have their names are all Persian. Actually, they're not Israelite names, or Hebrew names. And so I like that story. It just strikes me as like a Marvel movie with, you get the king of the demons drunk and then drag him back to Jerusalem and make him give you a special ring. And then you get this magic worm, and then you got to fight in the heavens. It's just like, it comes across like a comic book to me. I just find it to be, it's enormously entertaining. I mean, sometimes the stories are kind of creepy, but again, like it's because we horror movie-fy everything. We think of The Exorcist when we think of demons. Medieval people didn't think of demons like that. They were kind of they were bad, but mostly they were just inconvenient. And God was going to deal with them at the end of time by throwing them into hell or whatever. But in general, they're just sort of a fact of life, and you had to deal with them. And so in that way, I think that the ubiquity of them in the Middle Ages, in fact, the Talmud says that, this is particular Jewish demonology, that if you could see the demons, that's all you would see. They're that ubiquitous, that they're just everywhere. And so I like the idea that they're just everywhere, always around us. And yet we rarely ever encounter them these days. But yeah, there's lots of great stories, some of them creepy, but most of them are just sort of funny. Because I think people in the Middle Ages and people in the ancient world, they liked a good story as much as anyone else. And, their version of the Marvel Cinematic Universe was a bunch of people sitting around, a fire, being like, have you heard about this demon? And telling a story about how they bumped into them over in Berlin or whatever. And it must have been great stories. It's a pity we don't do that kind of thing more often.
No, that's definitely way more entertaining. Sounds great. Their use of the replacement of phones, they would tell stories instead. So you were talking about astrology and how it's related to like Solomonic magic. Could you explain?
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea is that medieval people thought that the planets and the stars radiated energy, and that radiation made its way down to Earth, and it could affect things down here. And so the idea was that in the same way that you had to time things down on Earth, you had to time things in accordance to how the heavens operated, and that astrological conditions, in the same way that, I don't know, you can get a plane delayed because of bad weather, you can get a demon delayed because of bad astrological weather. And so the idea was you had to understand what's going on up there to do things successfully down here. And the idea was it's all connected, and you have to learn how to manipulate both. Also, again, it's important to note, right? The demons lived up there. We have this bizarre idea they live in the ground. Medieval people didn't believe demons lived in the ground. They thought they lived just below the moon. And the idea is that if they live up there, you got to deal with up there to get them, right? And so astrology was just par for the course of dealing with demons, but it was also par for the course of anything. I mean, if you wanted to do business, you would time things astrologically. John Dee did the coronation of timed the coronation of Elizabeth I using astrology. This was just how you did everything in the Middle Ages. So it wasn't that astrology was uniquely connected to magic. It's just that astrology was connected to everything, and therefore, obviously, it was going to be connected to magic as well. So, and again, they lived up there, so you had to kind of know what was going on up there if you wanted to be able to muck about with them. Which again is just funny to think that we have a totally different conception of even where demons live. We think about summoning them from hell, but even that's not theologically consistent with most Christianity. And for both Protestants and Catholics, the demons aren't in hell yet. Hell's actually empty right now. Everyone's going to bad people will get sent there, and demons will get sent there later. But hell is empty right now, and they're roaming around here. But if you look at Faust or something, he's summoning up a demon from hell, but that's not theologically consistent with what Orthodox Christianity believes, or Judaism for that matter. There's not even really a hell in Judaism, and it's not consistent with the medieval metaphysics or medieval physics for that matter. So, yeah. So again, it's just funny how these things change. That we now think of demons coming out of hell like doom or something, but that's not consistent with medieval beliefs at all.
Did they get this knowledge from the astrological knowledge?
Where did they get the astrological knowledge from? I mean, they inherited a whole bunch of this stuff from antiquity, right? You have Ptolemy's Almagest and these giant textbooks of astrology. They also just got knowledge from looking at the sky. I mean, we don't see the sky anymore. Most of us have never really seen the sky because we live in cities. And so we don't really realize how densely populated the sky is, but if you go back 3 or 4 centuries, the sky gets densely populated, and it is outstanding to watch it over the course of several months and realize that some things are moving and some things aren't, and some things are moving in weird ways. And again, if you really do believe that all those entities up there are radiating energy that affects things down here, and you want to learn how they're, you want to be able to predict where they're moving, and of course that would eventually lead to the rejection of the geocentric worldview and things like that. So yeah, I mean, astrology was just par for the course of anything in the Middle Ages. But yeah, they mostly got the information from observation, and they got and medieval people inherited texts like the Almagest, which contained the theory of epicycles, and that explained retrograde motion and stuff like that. As much as as much as epicycles really explained it, I mean, it certainly helped.
Did the to do with this?
Come again?
Did the Egyptians?
Sorry, it broke up again. Sorry.
Did have anything to do with
Egyptians? Is that what you're asking?
Oh, the Egyptians.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the greatest collection of ancient magic, the Greek magical papyri, were all produced in Egypt. And so Egypt was the center in many ways of literate magic. We have it's a big volume behind me on the Greek magical papyri, some of which were written in Egyptian. The Egyptians pioneered techniques in astrology, like the house system. The deacon system is of Egyptian origin. So yeah, and the Egyptians, the classical Egyptians, really did believe that Heka, magic, permeated the universe, and they could manipulate Heka. And so in many ways, magic was much more ubiquitously practiced in ancient Egypt. Yeah, and also it was the cultural center of the world. Alexandria was one of the most important cultural cities, had the big library, it was culturally diverse, it was a melting pot. And so Greco, Egyptian, Jewish, pagan ideas permeated there. I mean, mean, if you go start naming off scientists and philosophers from the ancient world, you're going to name off people from Egypt overwhelmingly. And if they're not indigenously Egyptian, they're going to end up there. Distillation was perfected there. The alchemy really got its start there in many ways. But yeah, sure. Ancient Alexandria, ancient Egypt, Panopolis. These were the scientific and cultural, literary, philosophical. It was the center of the world.
Oh, so did the Egyptians get all this knowledge? Is it just by studying, experimenting?
Yeah, I mean, so the Egyptians, you're talking about a culture marked by extreme conservatism. Um, I mean, it's hard for us to imagine being able to look at a text if you look at English 1,000 years ago, look at Beowulf, you won't be able to read it. Egyptian priests maintained enormous amount of cultural conservatism when it came to their literature and their religious beliefs. So there was an enormous amount of cultural continuity that existed back in the day, and that enormous amount of cultural continuity also meant things like technological continuity. So again, if you look at the metallurgy of the guys that made the coffins of Tutankhamun, it's incredible what they were able to pull off. I mean, the metallurgy is just staggering in its complexity. And so, with that knowledge, and again, some of our earliest medical manuals, some of our earliest mathematical manuals, all Egyptian, the Bodmer Papyrus, things like that. So, if all of that is maintaining some degree of cultural continuity, when other places where there's constantly war and things got destroyed and libraries were lost, um, you could, in a quick way, combine a lot of knowledge, and you could have a lot of cultural knowledge being preserved. And to add to that, Alexander the Great showed up and said, "Look, you guys are going to be multicultural, and we're going to make a multicultural city, Alexandria, and I'm going to gather together every single person I can and every book I get my hands on, and we're going to basically build the largest repository of human knowledge in the world." And when you do something like that, when you make a massive investment in infrastructure and a massive investment in cultural capital in terms of library and research and development institutions, the way that were developed in Alexandria, unsurprisingly, you get a lot of really smart people wanting to come there and do a lot of innovation. And sure enough, that's what we see. We see people like Clement of Alexandria, not Clement. We see people like Zosimus of Panopolis. We see women active in the alchemy world. We know of two, Maria the Jewess and Cleopatra the alchemist, not the same as Cleopatra the Seventh. So there was some degree of egalitarianism. There was some degree of openness. There was some degree of willingness to investigate nature, and people got along basically. It wasn't some cultural, liberal paradise, but it was, at least in the ancient world, and maybe up until modernity, an enormous mixing pot of people that produced a huge amount of scientific, cultural, philosophical, magical literature. So yeah, Alexandria was the place to be. I'm not a fan of time traveling. I think that the past was mostly a nightmare. I wouldn't want to go back in time to do most of anything, because I think that it's all just Hegel called it the Schlechtbank of history, the slaughter bench of history. I think he's largely right. But I would like to walk around ancient Alexandria in the 3rd century for a day. That'd be cool to see.
Did the Egyptian occultism or magic of some sort?
Did the Egyptians have?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they thought that the world was permeated by this force called Heka, like the force from the Jedi or something, and they could manipulate it. They thought that they could manipulate it. They thought that they could make themselves eternal with it. That's why they did all this mummification and scarabs everywhere and all this. So sure, in the priesthood, like any specialized job, they kept their secrets. They had trade secrets, and if you have your trade secrets, you don't want to let anyone know how you do it. And sure enough, the Egyptians, had all kinds of the Egyptian priesthood had all kinds of very esoteric practices that we don't understand very well. There's a book that survived called the Demonic Book of Thoth. It's the most perplexing book to survive from antiquity. But apparently it had something to do with the initiation of Egyptian priests. But it's such a strange book. We can't make heads or tails of it. It's one of those books where we can read it, but we don't know what it means. So it's a particularly strange text. But yeah, of course, the Egyptians were their priesthood existed for. I mean, again, we should remember that Cleopatra the Seventh is closer to us in time than she is to the construction of the pyramids. I mean, people forget how, when the pyramids went up, they were still woolly mammoths living on islands in like Siberia. Uh, people really don't understand how ancient Egyptian society was and the high degree of cultural continuity they were able to maintain. Most people don't appreciate that. Now, there were destructions, the intermediate periods and the Hyksos coming in, but even with the Hyksos coming in and things like that, the cultural continuity persisted, even to the Nubian kings and things like this. So with that kind of enormous cultural connectivity, knowledge persists, and you just accumulate it over time. Again, show me metallurgy like the Egyptians had, and the sarcophagi of Tutankhamun anywhere else in the world at the time. The Chinese could probably rival it. But they also had an incredibly conservative culture. In some sense, more conservative than the Egyptian culture.
So, work with demons.
Did who work with demons?
Did the Egyptians work with demons?
No, they didn't. I mean, they had there were demons in ancient Egypt. In fact, there's a catalog now of they're cataloging every single ancient Egyptian demon that existed. The most famous one is Amet. This is a demon that ate your soul if you weren't good. The Egyptians didn't have hell. They just had a crocodile demon eat your soul when you died, which sounds inconvenient. But the Egyptians had tons and tons and tons of demons. Mostly, they didn't summon them and work with them in the same way that Solomonic magic does. They mostly tried to avoid them, which is the smart thing to do, it seems to me. But they were often taken to be responsible for things like illness. So you would have to deal with them in terms of treating illness. Although I will say that the Egyptians were much more naturalistic in their theory of illness compared to the Mesopotamians, who were much more interested in believing that all illness was a result of demons. That's a marked cultural distinction, scientific distinction between the ancient Babylonians and the ancient Egyptians. But the Egyptians also believe that demons cause people to be ill or mentally ill, etc. But, okay. But yeah, less. I mean, you do have them cursing people sometimes, but it's, again, it's not so much of not a big of a deal. Mostly you're trying to manage the demons, not summon them and get them to do stuff for you. But they had a whole range of spirits that existed, thousands and thousands of spirits that existed in ancient Egyptian culture. Like I said, I think that the it's Penn State is doing the demon encyclopedia. I think they're up to like 400 demons or something in ancient Egypt. They had a ton.
Wow. So
yeah, you can. I think if you go online and look for the dictionary of Egyptian demons, I think you'll find it. But what a fun job, just cataloging Egyptian demons all day. I'm sure there's some graduate student they got stuck with that one.
I just came up with it like right now. Do you think the demons physically build stuff? And by build stuff, could they possibly pyramid shape?
So they could build stuff. I mean, at least allegedly. I mean, the demons built the temple in Jerusalem, so that's a thing they built. Solomon had all these demons building the temple, so they could build stuff. I mean, they're made of something, so they can move stuff around. They can change shape, at least according to the European literature. They can shapeshift and change into different appearances. They also look really weird. Like some of them look like bats and bugs, and they have all kinds of bizarre, random kind of appearances. But yeah, they could also cause you to see things that weren't there. demons were known for engaging in illusions and making people see things that weren't there. So, in fact, Augustine, which I love Augustine, Augustine actually says that the demons are always just manipulating you. That the demons let you believe that if you believe if you believe the demons are doing something for you, really what Augustine says is the demons are actually playing the long game and they're conning you. They're making you believe they're doing things, but really what they're doing is just setting an elaborate trap so that they'll, you know, capture your soul and send you to hell. So I always like the idea of Augustine. He thinks, no, the demons really just are conning you, and they're really smart. They're really old, and you think you're in control with all these like magic spells and Hebrew chants and stuff. But the truth of the matter is they're just like long conning you, and eventually at the end of it, you'll just end up in hell. So I like I like Augustine's idea, and that seems the most reasonable thing to me. That if the demons really are so powerful and so old, a bunch of like mumbo jumbo is not going to trap them. They're just like conning you and gonna kill you. Which is what happens in all the stories, right? I mean, you know, it's the Faustian trope, which I like that trope.
Okay. So, relationships with humans?
Not in the Christian or Jewish traditions. But in the Islamic world, they have jinns. Jinns are not demons. They're like another species of people. Like they can convert to Islam and stuff. They're made of fire. And yeah, jinns can marry people. In fact, I was in Egypt once. And I was out in one of the villages out south of Cairo. And I was, looking, there's stuff everywhere. And one of the guys I was with was like, yeah, you should go to this village and meet this guy. He's married to a jinn. And I was like, yep, I'm going to go see that. And sure enough, we met this guy and he introduced us to his jinn wife. I mean, they have like names, like, I don't know. I forget what her name was. Miriam or something. I don't know. But they, you can like marry them. You can like,
Could you see her and like touch her? Was she like a human jinn in human form kind of a thing?
No. I couldn't see her. Yeah, I could not see her. He could. I mean, one wonders about, there's all kinds of things to wonder about. But yeah, I mean, in Islamic mythology, jinns are just like people. They can become Muslims. They can like, they'll be judged just like human beings. They're just another species of people. There just happen to be one that you can't see typically. So, but those are jinns. Those are a particular kind of being. They're not demons. But oh yeah, I mean, in Christian mythology, demons like sexually assault people all the time. There are incubi and succubi that are inherited from Roman magic. Yeah, and there's all these great stories. There's these debates in the Middle Ages about whether or not demons can impregnate women, and the answer is no. They can't impregnate women, but they can steal babies and make it seem like they're impregnating women. And apparently, demonic penises, phalluses, are always very, very cold. Women who allegedly had sex with demons reported that the sensation was like ice entering their body, and these demons could ejaculate, but the ejaculate was always actually semen stolen from dead bodies, and so demons would steal semen from executed criminals, and then they would use it to artificially inseminate women. This is how insane this stuff gets. Like it just gets like balls to the walls nuts. And this is the kind of things that like witch hunters are debating in the Middle Ages. Like, well, we have all these women that we tortured and they all admitted to having sex with demons. So how do they do that? And it's just what happens when you like introduce various streams of insanity into a conversation and you're dogmatically bound to believe this stuff. The crazy just gets turned up to 11. Especially when you start torturing people, they'll tell you anything at that point. So yeah, there's all kinds of great texts like the Malleus Maleficarum that deal with demon interactions with women. Typically, it's about demons having sex with women. Rarely, more rarely, is it demons having sex with men. That's much more rare. because these are all dudes writing this stuff, so they're just like celibate dudes want to have sex with women, so they're writing about that all the time. They're just working out their weird fantasies in witch hunting manuals.
Demons possess a human male and interact with a.
Yeah, I mean, demons definitely can possess people. They typically possess women, however, but they can possess men. This is another distinction between Jewish demonology and Christian demonology. Demons don't possess people in Jewish demonology. Spirits of dead people do, and in Christian demonology, demons do possess people. They typically possess people in order to, as an outrage against God. They'll do it in order to weaken people's faith. The idea is that if you possess a person, then you show that God is powerless to protect you, and therefore that might make you not a believer in God anymore. And so the demons are basically possessing people in order to get people to lose their faith. Although that would instantly be a sign for me to have faith if I saw a person that I thought was legitimately possessed, because by extension, this is Socrates' argument in the Republic, that if someone's being possessed by a demon, then there must be a god, probably. At least the chances go up. So it's funny that I think that in the Middle Ages, possessing people made people's faith go away. But now, if we had a rock solid case of possession, then it'd be compelling. At least it'd be somewhat compelling evidence that there must be something supernatural. I mean, if a person could get possessed and then float or turn their head completely around or something like that, that would be, they'd have my undivided attention.
Have you ever looked into exorcisms or like possessions, like in this current time?
I've attended them. I've been there's a big Christian institution that you may know, and that when people get possessed, they have to go to outside authorities to vet the possession case. That is almost going to always involve a psychiatrist, and it's also going to involve someone who's just a person who's academic in the occult or an academic in religion. And they do a series of tests to determine whether the person's suffering from merely suffering from mental illness or suffering from demonic possession or demonic obsession. Those are slightly different things. And you have to vet whether or not a person is possessed, and you write basically a report up that's submitted to the bishop. And based on those reports, the bishop will authorize the local exorcist to go forward. Exorcisms are relatively brief rituals, but they're done over and over and over again over the course of months. In movies, we only have an hour and a half, so they got to get that demon out of you quick. But in real life, exorcisms actually go on for quite some time. Typically, people have died from them. But yeah, I've been in the presence of an allegedly possessed person. I typically do the language test. Is how I would do what I would do if I wanted to figure out whether a person was possessed.
What is that?
And this involves speaking to them in a language they don't know, and seeing if they can respond. And typically, it's some language that I know that they can't know. So I would ask them in Aramaic. Do you speak Aramaic? What's your name in Aramaic? And if they don't, look, any demon worth their salt's going to know Aramaic, but most people don't. And so that's my test. I've not seen a demon pass that test. I have seen them throw grown men across the room. So that's impressive. So maybe they're an X-Man or something, but I've the language test, or you can do the trick where you always tell the priest that the best trick to do is the holy water switcheroo, right? It's when and what you do is you double blind it, right? You don't even let the priest know which one's the holy water. So you take 3 vials and then you switch them around and give them to the priest and let the priest administer the holy water, and or the wafer of the sacrament, right? Which they don't let anyone else touch beside the priest, so you can't switcheroo that one. But the idea, right, is that if the priest doesn't even know which one is the actual blessed one, surely the demon would know.
Wait,
They don't mean.
Sorry. Earlier
No
you were
problem.
talking about a man wall during like an exorcism.
Yeah. It was their case. I've seen a case where it was a 9-year-old grew man. Like, but again, like this is the problem. Like when you get into these situations, like how much is he letting himself be thrown? How much is he, if he's a believer in this, how much is he like, psychologically inclined to jump or so? I don't know. All that stuff is interesting, but to me the question is, demons are alleged to know all kinds of stuff, and it has everything to do with administering certain kinds of tests. But I mean, this is what also I think a lot of like edge core Reddit atheists don't really understand about religion, is that if you believe you're possessed, right, no amount of psychiatric care is going to undo that, right? You're not going to disabuse someone by saying, yeah, you're not possessed, you're just suffering from schizophrenia. Now they might be schizophrenic and possessed, right? But if they believe they're possessed, then we call that a cultural specific disorder or cultural specific disease. If they're suffering from a cultural specific disease, it's only likely that because of their psychological disposition, that exorcism is probably going to help them. Now that doesn't mean that even if you administer an exorcism, that you believe that they're possessed by a demon. It might mean that you have to go through the ritual in order to disabuse the person, to give that person the ability to disabuse themselves of that belief. So notice that there might be reasons why to do exorcisms, right, that have nothing to do with the belief in demons, but they might have to do with meeting a person suffering from a cultural specific syndrome. Because again, you're not going to like, I don't know, you're not going to Zoloft a demon away. It's just not the way. You're not going to be able to cognitive behavioral therapy away a demon. That's just not the way it works. So again, this is a situation where I could be interested and persuaded that an exorcism is in order, but not because I believe that demons possess people or obsess people. It functions as a psychological ladder for them to disabuse themselves of a belief, as opposed to you get a demon to come out.
Mm.
Which, yeah. So in there again, I might there might be a case where I would be like, yeah, go forward with the exorcism, but not because I believe in demons.
Mm-hmm. So pagans and other types of witchcraft are connected to Solomonic. So how are not connected, but they were influenced by Solomon. So how did that change their whole practice?
So Wiccanism, which is a species of paganism, is downstream of British early 20th century, late 19th century British occultism, ceremonial magic. So in that way, Wiccanism is connected to it, but other forms of neo-paganism are not. So Norse neo-paganism or modern day Druidry or something like that. Those are distinct strands of religion that are more or less not connected to the practice of Solomonic magic. But I have to say, I'm not an expert in contemporary neo-paganism. I have a good friend and a colleague, Dr. Angela Puka, who is, but I'm not. My knowledge drops off precipitously about 1850.
Mm. So what were they influenced by? Did they that were similar to like Solomonic magic?
So ancient paganism or modern contemporary paganism?
Ancient.
So, I mean, ancient paganism is just going to be, paganism sort of a strange word in terms of whether that term's helpful or not. That's a good way of answering this. So if we look at the Greek magical papyri, which were composed by pagan, Christian, Jewish, indigenous Egyptian magicians, Solomon is invoked in almost all those traditions because it was known that Solomon was a person who had magical powers. And because he was known to have magical powers, people would invoke him. And again, it all boils down to ancient sorcerers were not going to be pigeonholed into dogmatic religion. They're already not doing orthodox whatever. They're up to weird stuff to begin with at some level. They're up to some marginal stuff, and because they're up to some degree of marginal stuff, I mean, these prayers are hilarious because they'll invoke Jesus, Thoth, and like Yahweh all in the same breath. And they do not give a damn about these are different religions. They're like, nope, this is all kinds of, there are all these religions, and I'm going to call out to all the different gods that I need to get what I want. And so, what these texts are marked by, and what often is marked in the religious texts, is a great degree of syncretism, a high degree of syncretism. Something like voodoo, also marked by a high degree of syncretism. So, I think what's salient about the question about to what degree does paganism intersect with all this is that all of these ancient magical practitioners, ritual experts, they're going to be mixing and matching stuff because they're going to be trying to get stuff to work. And if you believe that the Jewish God is particularly good at doing X, Y, and Z, then you're going to call out to the Jewish God, because if you're a polytheistic pagan, you believe that all these gods exist anyway. You're just going to reach out to the one that's going to get you what you want. So I think that they're just, they're experimentalists, and they're going to try to get what they want. And the way that they do that, obviously, is by, grab bag, the grab bag of the gods. And of course, the bishop is going to be like, no, you can't do that. That's not allowed. These gods aren't really real. They don't give a damn what the bishop says. They're after doing magic anyway. So these are heterodox people at some level to begin with. So yeah, magic is going to be it's almost always marked by a high degree of religious syncretism, because it's not marked by dogmatism. Because dogmatism just it's a great way of controlling a population. It's not a great way of getting things done. So yeah, it's just not the way, certainly not the way ancient magical ritual practitioners worked.
So, I don't quite ancient paganism and modern paganism. So, what's the difference?
So ancient paganism is just what people believe that wasn't monotheism, basically. I mean, it's a term that it's not a great term because it's just about othering people. It's all the people that don't believe what you believe are pagans, it's more of a political term than it is a sociological term, in terms of trying to actually understand what people believe. But modern pagans are basically reconstructivists, religious people who are at some level reconstructing ancient polytheistic beliefs, whether it's the beliefs in the Norse gods or the Egyptian gods, or whatever, Babylonian gods, I guess. So that would be paganism now, be non-monotheistic, revivalist polytheisms, typically. Not all of them are polytheistic, but many are.
How about Wicca?
Wicca also. Although Wicca is much more closely tied to early 20th century ceremonial magic. So Wiccan ceremonies are going to look a lot more like early 20th century ceremonial magic. Gerald Gardner, the guy that founded Wicca, was in the same kind of milieu as folks like Aleister Crowley and Austin Osman Spare and people like that. So it's the Freemasonry and stuff like that. It's going to look a lot more like that. But that's not true of all paganism. In fact, Wiccanism is unique in that way in some ways. And even it's changed a lot. I mean, religions are marked by change. And, Wiccanism, the way it was practiced, 50 years ago is, not the way it's practiced now.
How was it practiced?
How is it practiced now? Oh, it's a huge range.
no.
I mean, coven to coven. Oh, back in the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can pick up, Gerald Gardner's book, and sort of look at the rituals. He basically developed a mythology that's a combination of some remains of European paganism, fertility. It's kind of a fertility religion, where you're, wedding the mother goddess and the father god together, and has a strong fertility element and tied to the year in certain kinds of ways. And there are rituals that are again taken from ritual magic and stuff like that. But you can pick up Gerald book, the Buckland Guide to Witchcraft, or Gardner's book, and you too can be a witch. And then, again, it depends on which coven you belong to. I suspect every coven's slightly different, in the same way churches are different substantially. There's no Wiccan priest. There's no like Wicca Pope. So there's no one telling you what to do. So there's not like a whole lot of central authority. And so there's not going to be a bunch of like Wiccan Pope tells you can't do this. You have a lot of control and things like that. It's decentralized. But again, my expertise drops off precipitously after about 1850. So I'm not an expert in modern paganism, modern occultism. It's interesting, but I just don't. Just want to be clear that my expertise does not lie there.
So we'll take it back then. So for paganism, why did they do magic? So like, what did they use it for? Was it for healing? Was it for harm?
Yeah, it was just in the same way that electromagnetism is a force of nature, right? We use electromagnetism to do all kinds of stuff, to hurt people and to heal people. We use it for everything. So just imagine magic was a force in the universe. Like, you have the strong and weak force, you have electromagnetism and gravity and magic. And in the same way that we manipulate the strong and the weak force and electromagnetism, which I guess electromagnetism is just a version of the weak force, but whatever. In the same way that we manipulate hidden forces in the world to, push electrons through this, that, and the other, and talk over the ether about ancient paganism, they just felt that magic was just a force of nature, just like, electromagnetism. And they thought they could manipulate it, and that it could be manipulated to do all kinds of things, and to get people to fall in love with you, to hurt people, to help people, to turn invisible, all kinds of
Did
stuff.
they do menial chores like washing the dishes? There was a comment about that earlier.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There are people with summon demons to like do like, one of my favorite stories is that golem making is a piece of Jewish magic. This is a creation of a humanoid from clay. But one of the earliest legends we have about a golem is a rabbi who created a golem woman to be his house cleaner. He's just like, I need a maid. So yeah, oh yeah. I mean, yeah, menial tasks, just like keeping bugs out of your house. Again, things that we just like don't think about anymore. Like, we don't worry about wolves taking your children. It's just not a worry we have anymore. But wolves would like take people's kids back in the day. And so you'd have like anti-wolf spells to like, prevent wolves from taking your kids out of your tent or whatever. So sure. Oh yeah. Menial tasks. I mean, everything from, manipulating the gods to get you stuff via theurgy, all the way to, clean your dishes. Sure. In the same way that, again, we use electromagnetism. I mean, we use it for like MRIs and dishwashers. In the same way that we think of there as a force that we can use technology to manipulate, the ancient peoples and medieval peoples thought magic was a force that they can manipulate. This is also another reason why I don't believe in magic, because if it did exist at all as a force of nature, then I always say that the easiest example of how it would be used is we would see it in the military. There'd be the Army, the Navy, the Marines, and the sorcerers. And they'd be out there throwing magic missiles and stuff. We wouldn't have drones. We just have people like throwing magic missiles from the sky or whatever. And so one of the proofs that magic isn't real is that if it were real, the DoD would be on it. And we know that the CIA tried to use things like remote viewing to spy on the Soviets. So it wasn't like the government was like, we're dogmatically against magic. That's stupid. They're like, yeah, let's try it. It's a lot cheaper than satellites. So, but the thing though is it failed. I mean, the remote viewers did no better than chance, and so it would see like it's very clearly didn't work. Also, cheating in sports was a big deal in ancient magic. You would bury things under the racetrack. I mean, the big thing back then was horse racing, chariot racing. And, chariot racing was not just like a sports thing in the ancient world, it was political. Various political factions were deeply connected to sports. The largest riot in history, the Nika riots under the rule of Justinian, I think they killed like 40,000 people. Belisarius had to be recalled from the conquest of Italy to come back and put the riots. There are dozens of spells for manipulating horse races, because manipulating a horse race it was a lot of money involved, but also the politics involved. It was hugely political who won horse races. So again, this is the kind of thing that, um, if I were, I don't know, LeBron James, like I might be using some magic to make sure I like hit it every time. Of course I would. And my agent certainly would want that. So sure, this is again I think the point that, um, I think if magic did exist, we'd be living in a very different world, um, because the world would be manipulatable. Elon Musk would be like the most powerful magician. He just buy a bunch of magicians,
Mhm.
or something like that. So it's not for lack of trying. Again, the Nancy Reagan had an astrologer. I mean, they were trying, um, you know, um, which is hilarious again because we think of them as being like that the reign of the Reagans being uber Christian with the moral majority and stuff. But I wonder what the moral majority people thought about that. I mean, like Pat Robertson, knowing he's a Reagan fan. I wonder what he was like. They have these satanic astrologers there. I don't know. I wonder how all that worked together. Maybe they didn't know.
What are satanic astrologers?
Oh, I think that the moral majority people would have thought that. I don't know that the astrologers would be satanic. I think that Pat Robertson thinks everything is satanic. That's not Pat Robertson, um, the 700 Club guy. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know what those like evangelicals. I mean, they would have thought it was evil. I think, but it's just again, we think of this stuff as outmoded, but um, you know, yeah, like we have the Reagans having a court astrologer, which is like something we associate with Elizabeth the First, um, but again, is it any weirder than Joe Biden being observant Catholic or whatever? As much as he is observant Catholic, I guess. Again, it's like that superstition continues to play a role in politics should be unsurprising. Whether it's state-backed super or church-backed superstition or just good old-fashioned using astrologers.
Do you think various types of magic have possibly
I'm sorry.
predict the future?
No, I mean I don't think that. I mean, yeah, I don't think that divination. I mean, yeah, I don't think divination can predict the future. Again, I think if it could, we'd be living in a different world. If I could predict 1% of stock trades, right? Just 1% of stock trades, you best believe I wouldn't be on live streams anymore. I wouldn't be on Patreon. Again, it's just like it's that if you could do that kind of thing, people would be doing it, and we just noticed like the weirdo astrology lady check out and like live in a private island all of a sudden. So no, I don't think that we can tell the future in tea leaves or the stars or whatever. No, I don't believe that divination predicts the future any better than chance.
Okay.
I wish it would. Trust me, people always think that I know the secrets because I study this stuff academically. And I'm like, look, man, if I knew a technique for telling the future, I'd dip out. Like I said, I'd open my my Robinhood account and I would tip out.
Win a couple lotteries in a row.
Exactly. It'd be over. I mean, I mean, it's not just a couple, just one. You just get the Powerball, just let it get up high and just, roll it. And again, if something is so insufficiently, effective that it's indistinguishable from chance, and I think that, the evidentiary bar is such that I'm just going to suspend belief that it's real. So if you always have a just so story why it doesn't work, I'm going to have a just so story that it's not real. So
you mentioned genealogy, and I had a question for that. So what is it exactly?
Did I mention genealogy?
Might have been from one of your other videos because we were watching your videos prior.
Well,
We lost Brenda.
We lost your video, Brenda, and we might still be able to hear you though if you want to ask the question. There you go. I think your phone just did the thing where it shuts the screen off if you leave it for too long.
It's the demons, man. I'm telling you.
It's the demons.
They're angry.
It says a tough connection.
Now the audio doesn't work.
Yeah, now we can't hear you. But we do have some questions from the audience that we can go into while waiting.
Sure. Yeah, I have about a half an hour left.
Cool. Winston's mom asks, I study esoterica also, and for the Kabbalah, I often tune into Beverly 720. Other than his channel, who does he follow?
I don't know who Beverly 7200 is. I mean, for Kabbalah, I mean, I'm not a Kabbalist either. I don't believe in the truth of Kabbalah. I mean, I read academic literature on Kabbalah, so I read everything from Gershom Scholem to my Eshed's new book on the Partsufim and stuff like that. So Liebes and the sort of classic folks who do Kabbalah. But I mean, I read Kabbalists, but I don't read them because I believe in them. I believe them because I read them because they're academically interesting. My favorite Kabbalist is probably Cordovero. I prefer his Kabbalah over Isaac Luria's, but I don't have a dog in that fight because I think they're both not. It's like saying I like X-Men more than like Green Lantern more than this. It's not because I think Green Lantern's more real.
So the Marvel versus DC.
Yeah, something like that. So I like Cordovero, but it's not because I like Cordovero because I think that Cordovero gets the Sphirot more accurately because I don't think there's such thing as Sphirot. So I just like his system better. It appeals to me aesthetically or intellectually something better.
Gotcha. Efont asks, are you familiar with the book boxes?
Yeah. So Dybbuk boxes are a thing in media. They're not a thing in actual Jewish lore. In fact, one of the rules of Dybbuk is they can't be put into boxes. So it's like the one thing that's not supposed to happen, they make movies about. No, Dybbuks can only live in human beings. Dybbuks have to go from people to people. They can sometimes go into animals, but they don't like doing that. So no, Dybbuk boxes are a thing that only exist on like Netflix and YouTube. Open a Dybbuk box at 3 a.m. Like it's that kind of stuff.
What's the Dybbuk?
A Dybbuk is so we don't have hell in Judaism. What exists in Judaism is a thing called Gehenna, and Gehenna is sort of like a period of purification for your soul before it's redeemed. So if you commit sins, you got to get it. It's like purgatory kind of. But some people are so bad they don't merit Gehenna, and their souls are destined to roam around. And it's apparently agonizing not to be in a body. Unlike Catholicism that thinks your body is evil and the body's bad, Judaism's all about bodies. We like bodies. But being without a body is painful, and therefore evil dead people try to get back into bodies, and they cling to people. Their soul clings to a new body. In Hebrew, the word for that is dabak, to cling. Like devek means glue in Hebrew, modern Hebrew. And dibukim, a Dybbuk, is a spirit of an evil dead person that gets into the body of a living person. Typically kills them. So again, in Judaism, dead evil people possess people, whereas in Christianity, typically it's demons possessing people. So different theories of possession. But no, there's no Dybbuk boxes are a totally fictional thing made up for TV. I mean, Dybbuks are fictional too, but
yeah,
it's more fictional. It's not rooted in actual traditional, not traditional folklore.
Winston's mom asks, have you studied Ouija boards and those who practice Ouija magic? And have you studied enneagrams? If so, what's your tri-type?
I've not studied enneagrams. So Ouija boards are from the spiritualist movement in the early 20th century, late 19th century, where it was like really popular to talk to dead people. And so these are the kind of people that Harry Houdini debunked. And so Ouija boards were basically like seances got to be really popular, especially after the First World War, because I mean, a lot of dead people. And what ended up happening was basically game makers capitalized on that and started making like a home version. Like, why go pay a seance person all this money when you can do a seance by yourself at home? And the Ouija board is Ouija. It's a yes, yes. And so typically it was just a board with a thing called a planchette, and you would use spirits to manipulate it and answer questions. My favorite versions of Ouija boards or planchettes are the ones that are actually on a piece of slate, and the planchette has a piece of chalk in it, and you would go into a trance, and the spirits would write things for you on the slate. So it's another version of the Ouija board that's far faster than spelling things one letter at a time. So you got to be more efficient when you're talking to spirits. You can't be wasting spirits' time.
Gotcha. Stephen Burdess asked, are you familiar with the Psychic Bible? And can you kind of explain what it is?
Never heard of that.
Fair enough. Tinkle Tink asks, are you Jewish?
Yeah, I am.
James Earl.
No, I wear the hat to get girls. Just
Great
really
strategy.
into Jewish girls.
That's right.
Yeah.
Pragmatic Crystal, Esoterica is awesome. We really appreciate the compliment. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Ask Justin if he thinks the medieval lesser key of Solomon and the evocation of worldly power, holding demons to conquer them and yoke their power, was Porto psychology.
It's really proto-psychology.
Proto-psychology.
So the lesser key of Solomon isn't medieval. It's early modern. It's from the 17th century. And do I think that political people, do I think that politicians have tried to use magic to get power? Sure, of course I do. I think it failed for them as much as it failed for anyone else. I think if your strategy for winning a war or getting political power is I will get spirits to help me, you're probably going to lose. You should just go read Machiavelli or something and do what Machiavelli says. So I'm sure they tried, but I'm sure it was just as successful for them as it was for all those people out there trying to use magic to get to Powerball numbers.
Gotcha. Mr. Creening asks if you think Egypt was the origin of the gematria of the Phoenicians.
To my knowledge, the Phoenicians didn't practice gematria. Gematria is a much later idea that occurs early on in Judaism. It's basically where you manipulate words and numbers and letters and numbers. And in the Hebrew alphabet, letters and numbers are the same thing. And so if a word says, I don't know, this in Hebrew, if you add the letters up, it'll produce a numerical value. And allegedly you can find all kinds of secrets by doing this. It's a great example of finding patterns where there aren't patterns. What are they? Pareidolia, I think they call that. So people found all kinds of weird things in the Bible where they would add up things and say, look, if you add this up, if you add this plus this equals this, and it's blah, blah, blah. There's all kinds of examples of this. For instance, Jews will often give charity in multiples of 18. Why multiples of 18? Because the 18 is the numerical equivalent of the word chai for life. So if you've ever gone to a Jewish charity and someone gives you $36, exactly $36, you're like, why the hell $36? It's because it's double chai. And so it's supposed to have superstitious value in that way. But the Phoenicians didn't. The Phoenicians, to my knowledge, didn't make use of this. The gematria was first employed by Jews and Greeks.
Mojo asked, do you read African mythology?
I mean, Africa is a real big place. I read Egyptian mythology. I've never read any, mythology from the Congo, but Africa is a giant ass continent, so I don't think there is a such thing as African mythology.
Captain Red Bull asks, his mom believes cardinals coming to her bird feeders are representative of spirits of loved ones. Can you think of a basis for that, like in other religions or cultures, or is it just a random thing she believes?
I mean, there are definitely cases where spirits are associated with birds because birds can fly. Think of the Holy Spirit being represented by a dove. Spirits also, in ancient Egyptian mythology, are represented by birds as well. So now that's not to say that she's getting it because she's getting it from ancient Egyptians. I just think it's a really easy metaphor to create. So the fact that lots of cultures have made this metaphor and that she has either inherited it or made it, it's very unsurprising. One of the things we have to always remember is just because two things parallel each other doesn't mean they cause each other. And so, it makes total sense to me that if you believe that the soul will leave your body and go somewhere else, and if you wanted to pick a physical representation of that, it's completely reasonable to pick birds as being a representation of that. And unsurprisingly, we see that in lots of world religions who may have not ever influenced each other.
For sure. Mr. Crean asked, do you think the Lesser Key of Solomon is cosmologically foolish?
I mean, it represents an early modern worldview. It's incorrect, but I don't know if that's foolish. I think that it's important to judge people based on what they had access to and what they knew. So I don't know that it's foolish. It may be strange to believe in now, but given what people knew in the 17th century, just as reasonable as anything else. I will say, though, the Lesser Key of Solomon is funny because it's based on a text called the Pseudomonarchia Daemonum by Johann Weyer, who was actually the student of Cornelius Agrippa, who wrote the big book on occult philosophy in the Middle Ages. And he wrote it as a joke.
Is that different from the Agrippa's Trilemma guy?
Yeah, I think that. What was the name of that book?
I don't remember. It's the philosophical argument from Agrippa's Trilemma that everything boils down to circular reasoning, infinite regress, or foundationalism.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe this isn't on the uncertainty. It could be. It may be the same guy. But at any rate, the Lesser Key of Solomon's based on a joke. It's like imagine if someone told a joke and you took it real seriously and started practicing it. It was kind of a hoax, and then it got taken seriously by a British necromancer, and it sort of became a thing. So in some ways, I don't know if it's foolish to believe in things because they probably didn't know that, but it is kind of hilarious that now historically we know that this super spooky book of magic was actually based on a guy making fun of magicians.
Gotcha. Slicey Slicer asks, what are your thoughts on Egyptian stand arrows, the ones that awaken a person's fighting spirit?
I don't know about that.
Gotcha.
I mean, arrows do play a big role in magic. I mean, also in divination too. The Quran seems to really dislike the idea of using arrows to predict the future. We don't know what the practice was, but it was clearly a practice that Muhammad did not like. So, at any rate, but I don't know about that practice.
Mr. Kreening asked about your rational cosmopolitan deconstructionist Judaism and how it squares with atheism.
Who said I was rational, deconstructionist, or cosmopolitan?
I have no idea. I think this might have been from a dispute of two different people in the chat about your position.
Yeah, I'm not a deconstructionist. I deeply despise postmodernism. So I don't. This is a bizarre. This looks a little bit like projection.
James Earl asks, have you read the Book of Houdini?
No, I've read a lot about Houdini, but I haven't read the Book of Houdini. Is it the book where he debunks spiritualists? Because I've read a lot of that stuff. Yeah, I love that. I love Houdini. I think that the skeptical community really should really respect him a lot more, because he really assaulted people that were really predating on people who had died in the First World War, and Houdini did a lot to debunk that stuff. And I really appreciate that work, because how crappy to lose your child in the First World War and only to have a bunch of like hacks siphon money away from you because they can contact your dead son. What a disgusting con job, and Houdini really, really hated it.
Yeah, I think that's actually, he was a big influence on James Randi and the magic community within atheism. There's a lot of magicians who are in atheism, like Matt Delahanty, and I think Seth Andrews was a magician at one point. But yeah, I think he had a big impact on the current big atheist community.
Yeah, I like Houdini a lot. I live in Detroit, and he died here. One of my favorite stories is that he gave his wife a code word so that when he died, if he could contact her, he would. He said he would, and she held seances for 10 years, I think, until the 11th year. And the journalist asked her, "Are you going to try to contact Houdini this year?" And she said, "No, 10 years is long enough to wait on any man." And I always appreciated that.
Gotcha. Well, we have been going for about 2.5 hours, and you said you have to go in about five minutes or so.
Yeah, about 5 minutes.
So I really thank you for coming on. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Yeah, if folks want to find me, they can find me at my website, just justinsledge.com. And if you want to take a look at this kind of content, if you like learning about this kind of content from from an academic, secular, critical, skeptical point of view, then you can check out my YouTube channel, Esoterica, where we really dive into this stuff pretty deeply. So if you're interested in learning about it without trying to be convinced that you should go practice magic, which I guess you could go practice magic after you watch the episodes. Let me know if it works. If you win the damn Powerball, you got to give me some of the money. So, so there's that. I really like the fact that people in the chat seem to be very obsessed about my religious identity.
They are. That is the truth. Mostly about your hat too. They have a thing about hats. So.
Yeah. It's. I'm also a connoisseur of religious hats. I'll say that the Copts have the best religious hats, in my opinion. I love the Coptic religious hats. I threatened my wife that I'm going to get one of the really big Jewish ones, the Strymel,
big square ones.
the big furry ones. They're very expensive, by the way. But I just kind of want to wear one of those with like this kind of shirt and just like kick it, because they're just really badass hats.
Yeah.
So I'm all about religious headgear. I think the one could be religious only for the headgear, and it would be completely a legitimate decision.
I think the same is true of like military uniforms, like the British guys who protect the Queen, who have that gigantic like 3-foot black woolly hat. Those things are awesome, and they can't make facial expressions, and you can just tease them the whole time.
Yeah, they will check you though. There's some great videos on the internet of people getting checked by those guys. The Swiss Guard are my favorite. The Swiss Guard are my favorite in the Vatican, who still wear like 17th century outfits, but are actually still Swiss mercenaries to this day.
Yeah.
I just love that. I love these weird traditions and how they survive in these kind of weird, obscure ways. It's just it's entertaining, if nothing else.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. And Brenda, do you want to give any links to your work? People can find out about your work. Thank you also for coming on. Appreciate it.
So my Instagram is Brenda with an extra A and then Costco. So that's CASCO. I am going to make YouTube soon and other social media platforms.
Awesome. Thank you both. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, man. Y'all guys have a great day. Thank you, Brenda, for your questions. Always feel free to shoot me some more.